When you're standing in front of a lens rack, and you start wondering whether the next purchase will actually change how your footage looks, the hesitation can feel like a wall. You've probably seen those glossy ads with cinematic squeeze ratios and a promise of that classic widescreen feel, but the real question is, will it actually work on my rig, on my budget, and in the everyday shoots I'm doing? I'm going to walk through the DZOFilm Arcana Anamorphic lenses, the 32mm, 45mm, and 75mm models, and break down what they deliver, where they might fall short, and who should consider adding them to their kit. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the Arcana series is built around a 1.5x anamorphic squeeze and a full frame coverage that promises that signature, cinematic look without having to crop heavily. The idea sounds great on paper, but the practical side of things starts with the minimum focus distance of 2.6 feet. That's a fairly reasonable distance for most indoor setups, but it does mean you can't get ultra-tight close-ups on a macro-type subject without moving the camera back or adding extension tubes. In real-world terms, if you're shooting a dialogue scene in a small room, you'll need to consider the space you have before you start framing. Many independent filmmakers have told me they end up pulling a few inches back just to keep everyone in focus, which can affect the intimacy of a shot. The front outside diameter of 80mm is another physical characteristic worth noting. It's not a thumb-sized lens you can slide onto a tiny mirrorless camera without thinking about balance. On a heavier body, such as a full-frame DSLR or cinema-grade mirrorless, the weight distribution feels natural, but on a lighter mirrorless kit you'll notice a bit of front-heavy drag, especially when you're hand-holding. That's not a deal-breaker if you're comfortable with a small rig or use a gimbal, but it's something to test before you commit to a handheld style. A big part of the Arcana's appeal is the T2.1-T16 aperture range. In practice, the open-stop T2.1 lets you pull shallow depth of field fairly easily for a full-frame sensor, but the jump to T3.5 at its fastest usable setting introduces a little more depth than the classic anamorphic look you might be chasing. What I found most useful is that the aperture ring is smooth and clicks at each stop, making it easy to transition from a wide-open creative shot to a tighter, more controlled exposure without hunting for the perfect setting. For an indie director who needs to move quickly between scenes, that tactile feedback can be a silent time saver. Now, let's talk about the 77mm filter thread. This is the size you'll need for any ND or polarizer you want to stack onto the lens. The good news is that 77mm filters are fairly common, especially in the cinema world, so you won't be hunting for a custom solution. However, each additional glass element you add can introduce subtle flair, especially with anamorphic lenses that already have a unique way of handling light. I've seen creators use a single ND to keep the look clean, but if you intend to stack several filters, you might notice a slight softening of the bokeh that the Arcana otherwise handles nicely. Who should buy these lenses? If you are a filmmaker who already shoots on a full-frame sensor, and you want to start experimenting with anamorphic storytelling without buying a full cinema-grade lens system, the Arcana set is a solid entry point. The 32mm and 45mm focal lengths cover most narrative work. The 32mm gives you a slightly wider field of view that works well for interiors, while the 45mm feels like a natural, eye level for dialogue. The 75mm version steps into the territory of medium close-ups and even some soft telephoto composition, which is handy for those moments where you want a bit more compression, or to isolate a subject against a background. On the flip side, if you're primarily a run-and-gun shooter who relies on lightweight gear, or if your workflow demands quick changes between lenses without dealing with focus breathing, you might want to skip the Arcana. The 2.6-foot minimum focus means tight spaces become a dance, and the front-heavy feel could wear on a small rig over a full day. Additionally, the 1.5x squeeze, while offering that anamorphic flavor, does not give you the extreme widescreen you'd get from a 2x or 2.39x squeeze. If your creative vision leans heavily into ultra-wide, cinematic panoramas, you'll likely need a different line. From a value for money standpoint, the Arcana lenses sit in a price bracket that's lower than most cinema-grade anamorphics, but higher than a typical prime lens kit. The real value comes from the combination of full-frame coverage and the built-in 1.5x squeeze, which means you can achieve a cinematic aspect ratio without losing the full sensor resolution. When I compared a test shot taken with a standard 35mm prime to a shot through the 45mm Arcana, the difference in the lens flares and the characteristic oval bokeh was immediate. Those look makers are hard to